Nothing is moving in the shallows. Look again. It's already there. It has been there for hours. That fish has no idea.
Its name is Tanystropheus. And if you'd been standing at the edge of that sea 242 million years ago, you wouldn't have seen it. That was the point. To understand how a body plan this extreme was even possible, you have to understand the world that built it. And that world had just survived the worst thing that has ever happened to life on this planet. 252 million years ago, something happened that dwarfs every extinction in Earth's history. Scientists call it the Permian Triassic extinction. Most people call it the Great Dying. Both names are accurate, and neither one fully conveys the scale. 96% of all marine species, gone. 70% of all land vertebrates, gone. 7 out of every 10 animals alive at the time. If the same proportion vanished from Earth's oceans today, you'd be left with a handful of generalist fish, some insects, and almost nothing you would recognize. The trigger is still debated. The leading evidence points to volcanic activity across what is now Siberia. Eruptions on a scale that pushed global carbon levels high enough to acidify the oceans and collapse food chains across the planet. Life didn't bounce back. It clawed its way out of the crater. And what it found when it got there was an empty stage.
By the Middle Triassic, the supercontinent Pangaea was beginning to fracture. Through that fracture ran the Tethys Sea, warm, shallow, brilliantly lit, teeming with early fish and cephalopods that had survived the extinction and were now reproducing into a vacancy. Apex predators had been erased. Every ecological role at the top of every food chain was open for the first time in 50 million years. Evolution doesn't advertise an opening. It produces a candidate, and then it waits. The world had just been emptied. The question was who would fill it first. The Tethys wasn't deep ocean. That's the detail most people miss, and it changes everything. Its most productive real estate was something far more specific. A vast network of shallow, rocky lagoons, tidal flats, and reef margins, rarely more than a few meters, roughly 10 feet deep. Warm, clear, the seafloor visible from the surface. Teeming with prey that had survived the extinction and was now multiplying faster than anything left alive could control. And here is the problem that every large predator in the Tethys ran into. That shallow margin was a trap. Too shallow for the body of any serious pursuit predator. Too complex in its topography for the open water chase strategies that fast, agile hunters depended on. For a Nothosaur, long-bodied, flipper-limbed, built for speed through mid-water fish schools, the rocky shallows were somewhere you passed through quickly on the way to somewhere useful. This wasn't a gap in the ecosystem. This was a job with no applicants. Rich in prey, inaccessible to speed, structurally hostile to every body plan that had emerged in the first wave of Triassic recovery. Nature fills vacancies. Always.
The only question is what shape the solution takes. And the solution that arrived at this particular problem looked, at first glance, like a design catastrophe. The shallows belonged to no one, until something evolved that didn't need to move. Here is the engineering problem, stated plainly. How do you build a neck long enough to dominate a hunting ground no other predator can enter, without that neck collapsing under its own weight, starving the brain of blood, or making the animal too unstable to hunt at all? Most vertebrates solve neck length with more bones. A giraffe has 7 cervical vertebrae, the same number in the human neck,
stretched into a neck that accounts for roughly 40 to 45% of its total height. A mute swan packs in 22 to 25 separate vertebrae to build a neck close to half its body length, flexible enough to coil into a graceful curve. Tanystropheus did neither.
13 cervical vertebrae, fewer than half a swan's, and yet that neck accounted for roughly 55% of the animal's entire body length, a greater proportion than the giraffe achieves, built not from extra bones, but from individual vertebrae stretched to a length that, in almost any other lineage, would signal a structural failure in progress. The neck alone ran close to 3 meters, roughly 10 feet, approximately twice the height of a tall man. But the vertebrae were only the beginning. Running along the underside of the neck were elongated cervical ribs, bony structures that overlapped multiple joints simultaneously, lashing the entire assembly into something closer to a javelin than a limb. No swan-like S-curve, no lateral flexibility. Closer to 2 meters, roughly 6 feet of essentially rigid bone, hinged only at the base, incapable of bending along its length. Think about what that actually looks like.
A Labrador-sized body, a 3-meter bone spear attached to the front of it. Every instinct, every principle of structural mechanics says the animal should tip forward the instant it tries to use that neck. And yet, it didn't collapse. And natural selection, which has no patience for expensive mistakes, kept this design for 37 million years without fundamentally altering it. That is not luck. That is an engineering solution so precise that every apparent flaw turned out to have an answer. Tanystropheus survived by vanishing into the stillness of the shallows. 70 million years later, a branch of Earth's most lethal predator lineage chose the opposite path, abandoning hunting to weaponize scale. This 6-ton giant carried 3-foot claws, but never used them to kill, creating a defensive geometry that made aggression mathematically irrational. If this breakdown of the shallows earned a like, the next investigation is already tracking. Subscribe to see what's waiting in the canopy. The fix for a 3-meter, roughly 10-foot structural impossibility wasn't a heavier skeleton. It was the water. Tanystropheus didn't hold that neck horizontal in open air, cantilevered like a crane arm, a posture that would have put enormous bending stress at the base of the spine. Instead, it anchored its body on rock or in the shallows, and let the Tethys carry the weight. Submerged or floating just beneath the surface, the neck's mass was buoyed by the water around it.
The structural problem wasn't solved. It was outsourced. And then there is the blood pressure problem. A giraffe pumps blood vertically against gravity across roughly 2 meters, roughly 6.5 feet, of height difference between heart and brain, and pays for it with blood pressure exceeding 300 millimeters of mercury, more than double the threshold that would be a hypertensive emergency in a human patient. Long-necked sauropod dinosaurs faced a version of this problem, scaled to a degree that still isn't fully understood. Tanystropheus had no such problem. Because the neck extended sideways over the water instead of upward into the air, the head sat at nearly the exact same hydrostatic level as the heart. The blood wasn't climbing, it was traveling sideways. A standard low-pressure reptilian heart, the same basic pump found in any modern lizard or crocodile, was entirely adequate. The anatomy that looks, on paper, like a cardiovascular catastrophe was in practice a cardiovascular non-event, solved not by a more powerful heart, but by geometry. There's genuine debate among paleontologists about exactly how much vertical range the neck base could manage on land. The fossil evidence constrains the answer without fully closing it. What isn't contested
is the payoff. Every apparent flaw in this design, the weight, the blood pressure, the rigidity, had an engineered answer. Not an obvious one, not an elegant one, but an answer. Evolution doesn't care about intuition, only results. Before the hunt, before the stillness, there is the skull, and the skull tells you everything. Large nasal openings, positioned high, ideal for an animal that hunts with its head at the waterline, breathing without raising its profile. One nostril break above the surface, the rest of the body invisible. The eyes are set for scanning water, not wide-mounted like prey, forward enough for hunting. And then the teeth, not blade-like, not flat, conical, multi-cusped and interlocking, arranged so that when those jaws close, the cusps mesh like fingers lacing together. Not a bite designed to shear. A cage, a trap that closes around whatever enters it. A fish that hits those teeth cannot twist free. You might assume the teeth are the most dangerous part of this animal. They aren't. The skull was the lock, but patience was the key.
It has been here for 3 hours. Not waiting in any sense the viewer would recognize. No tension in the body. No coiled energy. Just stillness. Calibrated to the point where the animal becomes part of the environment, indistinguishable from the rock beneath it. The fish circle. Every modern ambush predator, crocodile, frogfish, snapping turtle, operates on a version of the same principle. Stay still long enough, and the prey reclassifies you. You stop registering as a threat. You become furniture. Tanystropheus had 37 million years to perfect the technique. The strike, when it comes, is not a lunge of the whole body. There is no lunge. Modern ambush crocodilians close the gap in roughly 50 to 80 milliseconds. A human eye blink takes 100 to 150 milliseconds, roughly twice as long. The prey's escape reflex requires neural signals to travel from the eye, through the brain, down to the muscles. That entire sequence takes more time than the gap between alive and caught.
The most dangerous thing about Tanystropheus was never the neck, never the teeth. It was patience. 3 hours of absolute stillness. A metabolic cost so low that waiting was essentially free. An animal for whom doing nothing was, biologically, indistinguishable from working. For 37 million years, if you entered the shallow waters of the Tethys and saw nothing moving beneath the surface, you were probably already too close. In 37 million years of shallow water, the most dangerous thing was always the stillness. On paper, Tanystropheus should not have survived its own era. The Middle Triassic seas were filling quickly. Every vacant ecological role was being claimed by something new, and the designs being produced were formidable.
Nothosaurs, long-bodied, flipper-limbed pursuit hunters, reaching up to 7 meters, roughly 23 feet, were the dominant open-water predators of the period. Built for speed, built for the chase. Active pursuit specialists that fed on the dense mid-water fish schools the Tethys was producing in enormous numbers. Ichthyosaurs were trending toward full aquatic commitment. Streamlined bodies, deep tail flukes, oversized eyes suited to hunting in low light at depth. They were becoming, generation by generation, something closer to what we now call a dolphin than anything walking on land. And in the rocky shallows, placodonts, stout-bodied, heavy-jawed, built for crushing shellfish with teeth designed specifically for the job.
A slow, semi-terrestrial animal with a rigid neck and a sit-and-wait strategy had no obvious place in this competition. Except Tanystropheus wasn't competing. That is the key insight. Not a slightly different predator racing against Nothosaurs for the same fish schools. A different strategy entirely, operating in the exact zone those predators physically couldn't use, feeding on prey those predators structurally couldn't access, at a metabolic rate that made lean periods irrelevant. Nothosaurs needed steady calories to fuel constant, energetically expensive pursuit. When fish schools moved or thinned, the cost landed immediately. Tanystropheus, cold-blooded, sedentary between hunts, thermally buffered by the warm shallows, could absorb lean stretches that would have been fatal to an active hunter. Its low-calorie strategy wasn't a limitation. It was a competitive moat.
This wasn't one fortunate population in one lucky lagoon. This was a body plan that worked anywhere the right kind of shallow, rocky margin existed. A template so effective, it required no revision for nearly 4 decades of geological time. Tanystropheus didn't win the arms race. It left the arena and stayed gone for 37 million years. For decades, museum collections around the world held 2 distinct sizes of this animal. Large specimens, roughly 6 meters, roughly 20 feet, the fish-hunting predator we have been describing, and small specimens, barely 1.5 meters, roughly 5 feet, with proportionally shorter necks and, on close inspection, slightly different teeth. For 60 years, the answer seemed obvious. Juveniles, growing animals, future large ones caught mid-development. That was the assumption. And it was completely wrong. In 2020, a team led by Dr. Stefan Speakman at the University of Zurich did something no one had thought to do before. They looked inside the teeth. Reptilian tooth tissue lays down annual growth rings, thin bands of fast and slow mineralization, 1 per year, readable under a scanning electron microscope the way tree rings are readable to a forester. What those rings showed upended 60 years of assumption.
The small specimens weren't growing. The growth record showed fully mature animals, individuals that had reached their maximum size and stopped. They weren't juveniles on the way to becoming large Tanystropheus. They were adults of a completely separate species, sharing the same lagoon, buried in the same rock layer for the entire 37 million year run of the genus. And then, the teeth said something else, something larger. The large species, Tanystropheus hydroides, carried sharp, conical, interlocking teeth. A fish and cephalopod specialist. Gripping teeth, piercing teeth, built for slippery prey in open water. The small morph carried blunt, rounded, crushing teeth. The dentition of an invertebrate feeder, an animal built for cracking crustaceans and hard-bodied prey in the rocky crevices the large morph never touched. 2 species, same shoreline, same neck plan, completely separate menus, confirmed directly by stomach contents preserved in the anoxic shale of Monte San Giorgio on the Swiss-Italian border. Fish vertebrae and cephalopod hooks in the large morph, crustacean shell fragments in the small one. They weren't rivals sharing a habitat under tension. They were neighbors who had partitioned an ecosystem at the level of individual tooth shape, so precisely that each was functionally invisible to the other as a competitor. What overturned 60 years of consensus was not a new fossil. It was a new question, asked of teeth that had been sitting in museum drawers since the 19th century. Science isn't always about finding new evidence. Sometimes it's about knowing what to ask of the evidence you already have. 2 species shared one shoreline for 37 million years,
by agreeing, at the level of their teeth, to want completely different things. There was no asteroid for Tanystropheus. No impact, no winter, no single catastrophic event that marks its disappearance in the fossil record. What ended a 37 million year reign was arithmetic. A cold-blooded ambush predator built around a minimal energy strategy needs very little fuel to sustain itself. Models built from ectotherm metabolic scaling suggest a 6-meter animal like Tanystropheus hydroides could likely sustain itself on a small fraction, plausibly less than a tenth of the daily caloric intake a warm-blooded predator of the same size would require. That low metabolic ceiling was the entire competitive advantage. It was also the design's single critical vulnerability. The strategy only worked as long as the shallow, rocky margin existed. Remove the margin, and there is no fallback. As the Triassic moved toward its own extinction boundary, roughly 201 million years ago, the Tethys deepened and widened. The shallow lagoons and tidal flats that had been Tanystropheus's fortress for 37 million years began to flood. The rocky margins submerged. The borderland that no other predator had wanted became open water that every pursuit predator in the sea could now use. The math simply stopped resolving. A predator engineered for a few meters of clear, warm, shallow water cannot follow its prey into open ocean 100 meters deep. The low-calorie strategy that had been Tanystropheus's entire advantage became irrelevant the instant the only habitat that could support it stopped existing. The niche disappeared, and the specialist disappeared with it. Consider for a moment a different version of the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, one where those shallow margins persisted another 10, 20, 50 million years. In that world, the niche Tanystropheus had perfected might never have opened to anyone else. The herons, the egrets, the motionless wetland stalkers that define tidal ecosystems on every continent today might have entered a world where that job was already filled by a reptile with a 3-meter neck for tens of millions of years longer than it actually held it. And here is what that means for you. Somewhere near you right now, an animal you've probably stopped noticing, a heron at a pond's edge, ordinary, unremarkable, is doing the same job this animal invented. Same strategy, different bones. 200 million years of separate evolutionary history. The job was that good. The world didn't defeat Tanystropheus. It demolished the only address it could live at. Something is still in the shallows, still watching, still waiting, just beneath the surface. Tanystropheus has been gone for roughly 200 million years. No descendants, no surviving lineage carrying its blueprint forward. The design died with the habitat. And yet, here, at the edge of a marsh that didn't exist when the last Tanystropheus died, something is doing the same job, with a different set of bones, arrived at through 200 million years of entirely separate evolutionary history, across a lineage that didn't exist when this animal was alive. Biologists call it convergent evolution. When unrelated lineages independently arrive at the same solution, it means the solution isn't arbitrary. It's the correct answer to a permanent question. The question is as old as shallow water. How do you hunt in a place where the prey can see you coming? You stop moving. You let the environment absorb you. You become, for as long as it takes, indistinguishable from the things that aren't dangerous. And then you strike, faster than thought. 240 million years ago, something with a neck 3 meters, roughly 10 feet long, already knew that answer. It held that knowledge for 37 million years,
a span 6,000 times longer than all of recorded human civilization, without ever needing to revise it. The strangest thing about Tanystropheus isn't that it survived for so long. It's that it survived at all. By every intuitive rule of anatomy, the body should have failed. The neck too long, the limbs too short, the strategy too specialized for a sea that was slowly becoming something else. And yet evolution doesn't care about intuition, only results. The next time you stand at the edge of still water and see nothing moving, remember that stillness, in the history of this planet, has always been the most dangerous thing in the room.